I'm Matt. I'm a solutions engineer with Algolia, speaking to you from the middle of London, Shoreditch actually. And today I'd like to spend a few minutes helping you understand the fastest way to build a federated search experience. The first thing we need to do if we're going to do this is understand exactly what we're building and why. And I don't know about you, but on my first introduction to the search and discovery industry, federated was a term that carried a lot of, I suppose, baggage, and it's useful to understand. Let's look at the definition and an example. Here we've done a standard Google of the word federated to get us going. And let's pick out some keywords from the official definition here. We can see that we have a single centralized unit within which there are states or divisions, and those states or divisions keep some internal autonomy. So you have one big thing, container, and within that one big container, you have smaller things that exist in parallel with each other and which hold autonomy from each other. And so how might this apply to search, and why might it be useful as a concept? Well, think about your standard website. Let's take e-commerce as an example. The container, or the big thing, that could be your search results container, right? Now, what might you want to show in that search results container? Well, if you're an e-commerce business, naturally you're going to want to show products. But let's expand that a little bit. We're talking about search and discovery. Potentially there are other things that might be useful to show the user in that search container. What about FAQs or blog posts? Maybe that's part of the discovery journey. What about relevant brands or categories? There are various different content types related to their search term that might bring them on a journey resulting in what you need as a business, a purchase. There are multiple paths to get there. And so it's important to give people these options. And therefore, coupled with this definition, we now understand, and I'll show you through an example of Birchbox. I'll go lit. The federated search is about showing different content types in the results. Products on the left, categories in the middle, encyclopedia on the right in this example. Now this looks super easy, but in fact there's a bit going on behind the scenes here. Let's go back to the autonomy part of the definition. Products live on their own and they can get updated at any time with anything. The blog might live on its own on a completely different technology. Again, it can get updated at any time by anything. And categories is somehow linked to products. Products exist within categories, so we somehow need to build categories based on what products there are. And so showing all of this in one container related to a search term from a search bar, well, that's something that could potentially be complex. And I'm going to show you a way of building it for marketplaces specifically, a way in which that might help you get this up and running in, we'll aim to do it in, let's say, 10 minutes or so, right? And so one last note here, I just talked about marketplaces. Why is this especially important for marketplaces? It's because you may have a very large catalog of very varied products if you're a marketplace. And when you have a user searching through that ginormous catalog, it's very important to give them these kind of options. Now, we'll design this pattern not using an encyclopedia, not using FAQs, but we'll do it in a slightly different way that might be more conducive to marketplaces. So let's have a look. I'm going to move to code now. I'm going to switch across. This is VS Code. And we're going to look at, in general, two main files. We have an index.html and an index.js. In our HTML, we're requiring through a script our JavaScript file, which holds all of the logic and all of the JavaScript for our HTML. And so this isn't the hardest thing to understand in the world. What we're looking at here is our header, in which we're declaring a div with a class of a federated search container. So this is going to be our master container that holds everything. It's our big thing. Now within that, you'll see a couple of components, or rather HTML elements, that are linked to components. Our first div, you can see by the ID, is going to render our search box. Our next div is going to help us render our search box results. Next, within the search box results, we have some suggestions, some products, some brands, and some categories. So you'll see in a minute why this might be a good pattern for a marketplace to employ. And so with that said, we have our header. How are these divs rendering anything onto the page? This takes place in index.js. And here I'll show you the easiest way to go about designing this UI pattern. Firstly, we're going to use Algolia's JavaScript API client, the light version dedicated more to search. And we're also going to use instant search. If you haven't used it before, instant search is one of my favorite things. It's a set of UI libraries for almost every popular framework that gives you out of the box a load of logic and a load of display for the most popular components of search and discovery. Super cool. And so you'll see some of those examples here when we import some of the widgets. Search box, you'll see what index and configure means in a minute, and a refinement list. Now you'll see we have some custom components here. I'm going to come back to that in a second because it demonstrates another UX pattern that can be built on top of instant search. So I'm going to give you that as a bonus. But let's get going. Let's render some stuff onto our page. We're declaring our search client first, instantiating it, giving it an app ID and an API key. We're then going to declare our main instant search widget, pass it our API client and an index name. Now, this is going to have the ability to interact with the API and fetch stuff from this index. And bear in mind, an index is just one kind of data store in Algolia. It's a place where you can put a specific content type. Now we're ready to start rendering stuff. We can call the add widgets method for search, and within it provide an array of widgets to declare. The first one is fairly obvious. It's our search box. To the search box, we're providing a container, and as you can see, this is coming back to our div with the ID of search box. So it's going to render our search box in that container, into that div. And so let's see what that might look like. Oopla. Let's run. And visit our local host. And we can see our search bar here. So we'll design everything below it in a second, but this is the end result. And so if we inspect in that search bar, we can see indeed that it's rendering in the div with the ID of search box. But look at everything that's rendering inside of it. You've all this functionality. This is rendered in by the instant search widget. So super powerful. You get all of this out of the box. Now we have a search box. The next thing that we need to do, take our search term and search when something is entered in the search box. And we need to search in multiple places, right? I mean, look at the experience we're designing. We need to search in suggestions, products, brands. And so somehow we need to pipe the characters searched here to these different indices or places where we have content. And so let's do that. We're going to start from the left, and I'm going to show you a really interesting pattern that was added to instant search. Within add widgets, this array, you can actually add more widgets, but scope them to a different index. So here we had the index called instant search. Let's just say that that contains our products, right? And so by default, all our widgets are scoped to this index. But we can provide a different index and add widgets for that. And now Here you see a configure and a QS hits. I'll explain that in a second. Those widgets are scoped to that index. So what is configure going to do for us? Well, configure is a widget that can essentially, as the name might suggest, configure some aspects of search. Here we're saying hits per page, we're going to return 16. You can see that we're returning quite a few suggestions because we have space for it. So depending on your UI design, you might add less or more. That's the configure widget, and there are tons of different parameters you can add. You can always check them in the documentation. Next up, QS hits, whatever that is, and it's rendering into the container query suggestions. So let's double check that that is indeed in our HTML. Yes, indeed, it's right there. And so you saw before that search box, this was a just widget that we added, and we imported it directly from Instant Search. QS hits, on the other hand, is a local component that we have built ourselves. But we still have the ability to add it in as an Instant Search widget. So how is that? Well, what we're doing here is we're using a pattern from Instant Search, allowing you to build a connector. So here's the Instant Search documentation, and I'm going to show you this. Here we have hits for displaying results, and this is the default widget right here. We could have imported hits and just used that, and we do have some configuration that we can use. But if we wanted to customize the UI a bit more, then we can build our own widget by extending essentially or connecting the default widget with our own rendering. And so that's precisely what we're going to do in QS hits. We're using the Instant Search connector for connect hits. We're providing a render function which renders our UI. And we're exporting this component, this function component, wrapped in connect hits. So wrapping that gives us all of the logic and functionality that the original hits component had, while making sure we have full control over our own UI and our rendering. That's slightly awesome. And so that's why we can use this just as like any other Instant Search widget. We just add it in here, and that results in the suggestions right here. And so what's next? We have product results. So I'm going to just do this so it's a little bit easier to see. I'll do this first as we get further down the page. Well, now take a look at this. We're providing another configure. But notice here that we're not actually providing an index to this. You'll see here we did scope this to an individual index for query suggestions, but we're not doing that here for configure. And therefore, it's going to be scoped to our default index name for Instant Search, and that contains our products. So we're now saying whenever we look up the products index, limit the number of hits returned per page to 4, and we're going to provide our product hits component. Once again, this is using the connectors for the hits widget, and it looks exactly the same as our other QS component. Connect hits, render, export, wrap it in connect hits. And so doing this without scoping to an individual index gives us the default index and our products component right here. Lastly, let's look at brands and categories. We said earlier that these are related to products in some way. So should we scope this to another index or not? How do we build it? Well, we're going to use something that is called a refinement list. You can see the documentation here. And it's about filtering the data set based on facets. So what you see here, filter based on facets. Brand is a facet, categories are a facet. When you declare this widget, you simply need to pass in a couple of things. Like the others, the container, but also the attribute. What should you be refining? And you can also pass a limit and other parameters that you can look up into the documentation. Since our facets are living on our products index, we don't need to scope this to another index. We can just use our default. And so after we've done all this, we've added all our widgets, we can call search.start. And as you can imagine, everything functions out of the box. If we choose one facet here, other facets disappear, the products get updated, everything is being piped around to each individual component automatically. We have the suggestions rendering. Everything is working. Personally, this blew my mind the first time I tried it. It gives you such a leg up while giving you patterns to control the UI in the way in which you don't lose the logic functionality. So that's very important. And that's federated search in a nutshell. So we go back here, let's summarize. We have our HTML, divs with IDs. We can then, in a JavaScript file, import instance search and an API client, instantiate the client, declare our main instance search widget or component, add our widgets, called search.start, and each widget should relate to a container which is present in the HTML. Well, that's it, folks. Not too bad for a few minutes work. Again, I said we'd look at why this is important for marketplaces, this pattern. And I'd just like to point out here that we could have gone for, let's say, products on the left and blog on the right. But in this instance, let's say you have a wide and large catalog. You are a marketplace, maybe you have user-generated content or user-uploaded products. And so you can have very varied product names, descriptions, and everything else. And it's also hard to know when you've such a varied catalog exactly what users are going to be searching on or refining on. And so this gives you a way of helping them on their discovery journey. From popular search suggestions to products themselves, obviously. But when you refine in here, well, you still get the products themselves, so you don't lose anything. Now, since this isn't a live production site, we haven't generated suggestions for, possible refinements, but you could indeed do that, and you could go as far as personalizing query suggestions and personalizing the results through our personalization feature. So a good pattern, easily implementable. And I forgot to mention that the styling you see here, we have some custom styling in app.css, but actually you get most of this out of the box by importing the instance search styles sheet up here. So you get that out of the box too. Well, thank you, folks. Appreciate you staying with me. And if you have any questions about instance search or the widgets or anything else we've showed you here, or marketplaces in general, UI patterns in general, feel free to get in touch.